There comes a juncture in every empath's life when the core emotional engine within them falls completely silent. It is not a state of being broken, nor one of blazing anger. It is simply a profound sense of being finished. Carl Jung identified this phenomenon not as depression or generalized emotional exhaustion, but as the final, revolutionary stage of spiritual awakening. This silence inevitably terrifies onlookers, because when an empath truly ceases to care, they do not devolve into cruelty, they ascend to a state of being untouchable, and this recalibrates every relationship around them. Jung devoted decades to observing patients who reached this psychological summit. What he uncovered fundamentally challenges our assumptions regarding empathy, spirituality, and personal transformation. The moment the empath stops caring is not the terminus of their journey, it is the potent genesis of something far more substantial. Understanding the mechanism behind this change might be the most crucial psychological insight one ever encounters. Before dissecting why empaths achieve this state of detachment, we must first examine the conditions that drive them to the precipice. Jung documented a consistent, agonizing pattern across his most emotionally sensitive subjects. These were not individuals who merely felt things deeply on occasion. Their entire nervous system functioned as a high-fidelity emotional receiver for the psychological landscape around them. They entered a room and instantly absorbed the collective atmosphere. Family gatherings left them depleted from managing everyone's unspoken tensions. Friendships became taxing as they perpetually carried the emotional weight of both sides in every conflict. Romantic relationships proved nearly destructive, precisely because they experienced their partner's pain with an intensity often greater than the partner themselves. Jung famously dubbed these individuals the emotional shock absorbers of their social systems. They didn't just sympathize with suffering, they internalized it, processed it, and somehow transmuted it so that others within the system could continue to function. Parents offloaded their anxiety onto them. Siblings treated them as readily available, free therapists. Partners relied on them like emotional support animals, whose sole purpose was to stabilize their moods. And here was the most disturbing facet of Jung's observation. These empaths never protested. They embraced this strenuous role as their essential purpose. They genuinely believed their profound sensitivity obligated them to sacrifice their own inner peace for the comfort of everyone else. They wore their exhaustion as a badge of honor, concrete proof they were moral people whose capacity for care necessitated their own suffering. The conditioning was rooted deeply in cultural narratives. From their early years, they were lauded for their understanding, for ameliorating the distress of others, and for maintaining peace. Each instance they suppressed their own legitimate needs to accommodate another person, they received powerful validation. Every time they absorbed someone's rage to prevent an argument, they were praised for being wise beyond their years. This cycle of positive reinforcement manufactured a pattern of self-abandonment that they mistook for ultimate virtue. However, Jung saw what the empaths themselves could not yet perceive. Beneath their actively compassionate facade, their psyche was meticulous. It was keeping flawless records. Every subtle manipulation, every slight betrayal, every time their kindness was exploited, the empath's unconscious mind was not randomly absorbing the experience, it was surgically cataloging patterns of behavior with staggering precision. Consider a composite case profile that perfectly encapsulates this dynamic. We see this structure in the history of an individual who spent a decade and a half managing their family's persistent dysfunction. They knew precisely which phrases would activate their mother's guilt trips. They understood the exact emotional sequence their father utilized to deflect accountability. They could predict when siblings would strategically engineer a crisis to regain attention. They had meticulously mapped every psychological game being played around them, with the accuracy of a cartographer charting intimately familiar territory. Yet, here is what Jung found truly exceptional. Despite possessing this lethal knowledge, they never once weaponized it. They simply continued absorbing, continued caring, and continued giving until something core inside them started to fracture. Their consciousness had evolved into a detailed archive of everyone else's patterns, while their own critical needs remained suffocated beneath layers of service and sacrifice. This created what Jung identified as a dangerous psychological split. On the surface, the empath was functional, even excelling in their role as the indefatigable caretaker. But beneath that exterior, Resentment accumulated relentlessly, pressurizing like steam in a sealed container. This was not the conscious resentment that can be healthily voiced and released, but an unconscious, corrosive bitterness that poisoned their fundamental sense of self.
The decisive breaking point invariably stemmed from betrayal, not mere disappointment or standard conflict, but a profound violation of trust from someone the empath had unconditionally protected, defended, and loved. Jung meticulously documented this trigger across dozens of clinical cases, identifying it as the necessary catalyst that forces the integration of the shadow self. Let us consider narrative illustrations that demonstrate this pattern. Imagine the story of the individual who discovered their partner's infidelity after years of managing that partner's emotional instability, deep depression, and anxiety. Or perhaps the adult child who learned their parent had been speaking cruelly about them behind their back after decades of serving as the family's steadfast emotional glue and tireless mediator. Or the friend who uncovered devastating, systemic lies after years of carrying secrets and providing boundless support. What made these betrayals so utterly destructive was not merely the act itself, but the empath's sudden, sickening recognition that they had seen the warning signs all along and had deliberately chosen to ignore them. Their intuition had screamed the truth for months, or even years, but they had violently silenced it. They chose to believe the best in someone who was actively showing them exactly who they were. They had, in essence, betrayed themselves to preserve a comforting fantasy of who others could ultimately become. This self-betrayal cut deeper and more painfully than the external wound. The empath realized they had been an active participant in their own exploitation. They had ignored their inner voice, dismissed their visceral gut feelings, and willingly overridden their own boundaries to maintain relationships that were systematically destroying them. The resulting fury was not just directed at the betrayer. It was a profound anger toward themselves for allowing the system to continue long after they knew better. Empaths are not broken people. They are alchemists in the process of radical transmutation. That realization shattered something foundational, not their heart, but the elaborate scaffold of their illusions. Jung termed this process the withdrawal of projections. The empath had been projecting goodness, elevated potential, and intrinsic innocence onto people who demonstrably did not possess those qualities. They had been seeing not who people were, but who the empath desperately needed them to be. When those projections finally collapsed, the empath did not collapse, rage, or weep the way everyone anticipated. Instead, something far more chilling and complete occurred. They became quiet, radiating an unnatural calm. Their eyes changed, not wet with tears, but brilliant with absolute clarity. The persistent emotional fog lifted, and for the first time in their life, they perceived reality without the severe distortion of their frantic hope. Jung described this moment as one of the most sobering psychological transformations he ever witnessed in his clinical practice. The empath immediately ceased performing emotional labor. They stopped managing the feelings of other people. They stopped explaining, justifying, or apologizing for their own necessary needs. They did not announce these changes. They did not issue dramatic declarations. They simply withdrew their participation from the dysfunctional systems they had previously held together through sheer will. Family members who had relied on them to mediate conflicts suddenly found themselves forced to confront each other directly. Partners who had used them as emotional crutches discovered they could no longer provoke the familiar cycle of reaction and rescue. Friends who had treated them as free, endless therapists encountered unwavering boundaries where infinite availability once existed. The empath had effectively withdrawn their precious energy from the emotional economy that relied entirely upon their exploitation. And here is what made this transformation so deeply unsettling to others. The empath was not angry. Anger would have been recognizable, manageable, something others knew how to engage with or manipulate. They knew how to handle the empath's anger because it always inevitably dissolved back into forgiveness and resumed caretaking. This was not anger. This was complete, surgical indifference to the toxic emotional games that had once commanded their existence. People around them attempted every tactic to provoke the old responses. They manufactured complex crises. They played the victim with theatrical skill. They guilt-tripped and manipulated relentlessly. But nothing worked. The empath had utterly unplugged from the emotional matrix that used to control them. They observed these desperate attempts with detached curiosity, much like a scientist calmly observing predictable, repeatable behavior in a laboratory setting. Jung identified this shift as the full integration of the shadow self. Every empath carries a shadow they have been rigorously conditioned to deny, the part of them that is self-focused, that prioritizes their own survival, and that adamantly refuses to save people from themselves. Society had convinced them this shadow was inherently evil, something to be ruthlessly suppressed and overcome. Religious teachings exalted selflessness as the highest virtue. Cultural narratives praised endless, selfless sacrifice. Family systems consistently rewarded their profound self-abandonment. But Jung understood that this shadow was not evil. It was the empath's vital survival instinct. It was their innate psychological immune system, attempting to protect them from being consumed entirely by the dysfunction of others. When the ultimate betrayal finally forced them to integrate this protective shadow, they did not become cruel. They became complete. The supposedly selfish shadow merged seamlessly with the compassionate light, forging something society had never prepared for. An empath who could still feel everything, but who chose consciously and precisely where to direct that feeling. An empath who saw through every manipulation, but no longer felt obligated to pretend they did not. An empath who loved deeply, but only those individuals who had demonstrably earned access to that love through reciprocity and mutual respect. This is what Jung truly meant by the final stage of spiritual awakening, not transcending the ego, but consciously integrating all aspects of the self into sovereign choice. The empath had spent their entire life intensely caring for others at their own mortal expense. Now they were learning to care for themselves with the same fierce intensity they had once dispensed so freely. This was not selfishness. This was self-preservation, finally being honored as sacred. The shift in energy was immediate and unmistakable. Where the empath had once radiated indiscriminate warmth, they now emanated something far more selective. Not coldness, but clear consciousness. They no longer leaked their essential emotional energy to anyone who simply demanded it. Their presence felt profoundly different, grounded, rooted, and psychologically impenetrable. They had become what Jung termed selectively empathetic. To some observers, this new selectivity looked like healthy boundaries. To others it was interpreted as unforgivable cruelty. The empath stopped responding instantly to manipulative texts. They allowed phone calls from known energy vampires to go straight to voicemail. They began saying no to unreasonable requests that once would have instantly guilted them into an automatic yes. They stopped attending family gatherings that reliably left them emotionally devastated. They conclusively ended friendships that had always been ruthlessly one-sided. They walked away from people they had spent exhausting years attempting to save. But here is the truth that outside observers failed to grasp. The empath had not stopped caring about these people. They had stopped caring about maintaining relationships that required them to betray their own soul. They had stopped caring about being liked by people who had never genuinely valued them. They had stopped caring about keeping the fragile peace in systems that were fundamentally built upon their silent suffering. The empath finally understood a foundational truth that Jung had attempted to teach for decades. You cannot effectively love others until you first love yourself. This is not the shallow self-love of narcissism, but the deep, uncompromising self-respect that refuses to participate in your own destruction. This was the foundational pillar that had always been absent from their previous relationships. In the professional environment, this transformation manifested as professional boundaries that profoundly shocked colleagues. Consider a composite example, based on strictly observed patterns in Jung's later writings. We see this dynamic clearly in workplace scenarios where the individual who once absorbed everyone's stress and tirelessly managed all office drama simply stopped. They continued to complete their assigned work with excellence, but ceased taking on the responsibilities of others. They attended meetings, but no longer automatically smoothed over conflicts that were not theirs to fix. They remained pleasant, but utterly impenetrable to the emotional manipulations that used to derail their focus. Managers who had relied on them to silently execute three people's jobs suddenly faced someone who worked their contracted hours, and nothing more. Co-workers who had dumped their personal problems on them encountered polite, firm redirection to appropriate resources.
The entire office dynamic shifted profoundly because the empath had purposefully removed themselves from the role of the universal emotional dumping ground. Productivity sometimes suffered initially, precisely because the established system had been designed around their prior exploitation. In family systems, the consequential changes were even more dramatic and unsettling. Let's look at a narrative illustration of this pattern. The empath who had always hosted the holidays, mediated every feud, and absorbed everyone's intergenerational dysfunction, stopped performing these functions. Not with aggressive announcements or bitter confrontations. They simply became consistently unavailable for the roles they had been unconsciously assigned since early childhood. Parents who had treated them as emotional support discovered unyielding boundaries. Siblings who had exploited their generosity encountered absolute limits. The extended family who had taken them for granted faced a version of the empath they failed to recognize. Someone who smiled politely but refused to engage with drama. Someone who loved from a necessary distance rather than drowning in destructive proximity. Someone who said, "That doesn't work for me," without feeling the need for lengthy explanation or apology.
The family often reacted with instantaneous shock and accusations. "How could you be so selfish? What happened to you? You've changed." And the empath would simply nod calmly, because yes, they had changed. They had finally stopped setting themselves on fire to keep others warm.
The most profound and definitive shift occurred in romantic relationships. Empaths who reached this stage either fundamentally transformed their partnerships or ended them entirely, without the usual, agonizing pain. Partners who had relied upon the empath's seemingly endless forgiveness suddenly faced uncompromising accountability. Behaviors that had been tolerated for years were now instantly and completely unacceptable. The empath stopped exhaustively explaining why certain things hurt them. They simply removed themselves from any situation that violated their hard-won peace. Some partners rose to meet this new version of the empath. They recognized they had been taking cruel advantage of an extraordinary person and chose to become worthy of that person's renewed love. These relationships evolved into something far healthier, balanced, and built on mutual respect rather than one-sided emotional labor. The partnership transformed from a draining parent-child dynamic into a bond between two sovereign adults consciously choosing each other. Other partners could not adapt. They desperately missed the previous version of the empath, who absorbed their dysfunction, managed their unstable emotions, and asked for nothing real in return. When they attempted their familiar manipulation tactics and found them utterly ineffective, they often left, searching for a new, compliant empath to exploit. The awakened empath let them go without the usual debilitating pain, recognizing the departure as ultimate protection rather than an unfortunate loss. Jung observed that this terrifying indifference caused genuine panic in the empath's social circle, not because the empath became vindictive or mean, but because their definitive absence instantly revealed how much deep dysfunction they had been diligently concealing. Family systems that had appeared functional instantly fell apart without the empath holding them together. Friendships that seemed deep revealed themselves as purely parasitic. Workplaces that ran smoothly descended into chaos without the empath's invisible emotional labor. The people who had benefited most from the empath's unconscious servitude suddenly grasped the immense resource they had lost. But by then, the empath had moved beyond caring about their realization. This was not revenge. This was profound sovereignty. The empath had finally learned that their powerful gift was not meant to be given indiscriminately to everyone, but fiercely protected and shared only with those who genuinely valued it. Jung referred to this state as psychologically invincible, not because nothing could ever hurt the empath again, but because they had flawlessly integrated their intense capacity to feel everything with the newly acquired wisdom to consciously choose their responses. They could still acutely sense the pain of others, read emotional atmospheres flawlessly, and perceive unspoken truths. But these perceptions no longer commanded or controlled them. They had become the conscious director of their own empathy, rather than its unconscious slave. This is where Jung's research unveiled something both beautiful and strategically terrifying. These awakened empaths developed intuitive abilities that made them nearly impossible to manipulate. They could instantly identify narcissists within minutes of meeting them. They recognized the tactics of love bombing, future faking, and gaslighting long before these strategies could take any meaningful root. They sensed inauthentic, predatory energy and simply refused to engage with it. Their integrated consciousness functioned as an automatic, unerring early warning system that protected them without conscious effort. Crucially, they did not utilize these formidable abilities destructively. They possessed the psychological insight required to weaponize their knowledge and strategically dismantle everyone who had ever hurt them. They held intimate, detailed knowledge of others' vulnerabilities, deepest fears, and weaknesses. Yet, they deliberately chose not to retaliate. They simply removed toxic people from their lives and moved forward without looking back. This remarkable restraint came not from residual weakness. Their non-retaliation stemmed not from deficiency, but from an authentic indifference to vengeance. This profound level of self-control troubled Jung, not because he desired them to retaliate, but because he recognized the staggering reservoir of power they consciously decided not to wield aggressively. These awakened empaths had evolved into psychological savants, possessing an understanding of human nature far beyond the common grasp. They held the capacity to manipulate, control, or even devastate others if they chose. Yet they consciously deployed this immense influence solely to safeguard their inner peace and facilitate the growth of those genuinely ready for change.
This precise and selective deployment of their abilities engendered what Jung termed the empath's mirror effect. Their mere integrated presence became a psychic litmus test, making inauthentic individuals deeply uncomfortable. Manipulators sensed immediate exposure, often without the empath needing to utter a single challenging word. Energy vampires instantly recognized the futility of feeding there and quickly sought easier prey. Conversely, those operating from a place of authenticity finally experienced a profound sense of safety around the awakened empath, seeing someone who perceived them clearly, yet without judgment. The awakened empath functioned as a living, breathing filter. Their refined consciousness automatically repelled negativity and dysfunction while effortlessly attracting opportunities for genuine growth. They no longer had to actively scrutinize potential connections. Their integrated presence naturally managed their perimeter. Those unable to tolerate such profound clarity instinctively withdrew, while those valuing authentic connection gravitated closer. Their entire social ecosystem consequently transformed completely, requiring no deliberate maneuvering. Jung chronicled the profound shift as these empaths reconstructed their lives upon radically different foundations. They purposefully sought careers that honored, rather than exploited, their heightened sensitivity. Some became therapists, skillfully holding space for clients without absorbing their pain. Others transitioned into artists, channeling their acute perception directly into creative output. Many gravitated toward work offering solitude and autonomy, rigorously guarding their energetic reserves against constant depletion. They cultivated friend groups defined by genuine reciprocity, abandoning former rescue or martyrdom dynamics. Every relationship became a conscious, deliberate choice, displacing unconscious, draining obligations. They entered romantic partnerships as fully integrated individuals, rejecting the roles of fixer or savior, selecting partners who prioritized peace as much as they did, partners who understood that true love never necessitates suffering. This sweeping transformation occurred because they finally learned to value and prioritize their own well-being with the same fierce intensity they had previously reserved for others. Their homes ceased being open hospitals and became true sanctuaries. Their time, once infinitely available, became precious and finite. Their energy, once carelessly distributed, was now treated as sacred and consciously guarded. They realized that protecting their inner peace was not an act of selfishness. It was essential for their survival and critical for maximizing their positive contribution to the world. This shift, the moment they ceased caring about the dysfunction of others, became the precise moment they started deeply caring for their own soul. This was the ultimate act of radical self-love. It was not fueled by narcissism or selfishness, but by the profound recognition that their powerful gift of empathy demanded boundaries
protection, and conscious, directed application. They finally internalized the core lesson Jung sought to impart to all his patients. You cannot pour from an empty cup, and self-inflicted martyrdom serves absolutely no one. Jung understood this culminating metamorphosis as the birth of the sovereign individual. This was a person who had consciously journeyed through phases of unconscious empathy, navigated betrayal, and profound emotional breaking, integrated their own shadow, and emerged as a deliberate chooser of their reality. They no longer merely reacted to the relentless emotional demands of others. Instead, they responded intentionally from a place of secure, integrated wholeness. Every action became a mindful decision, never a reflexive reaction. The empath who finally ceases to care has not lost their humanity. They have profoundly found their authentic power. They haven't become cold. They have become fully conscious. They haven't stopped loving. They have learned to direct that same fierce devotion they once squandered indiscriminately back toward themselves. This evolution represents the very highest form of psychological development Jung identified in his extensive work. This is precisely why Jung often referred to it as the final stage of spiritual awakening. Not because there is nowhere left to expand, but because the empath has finally and irreversibly integrated the fundamental, protective lessons. Their sensitivity is sacred, their energy is invaluable, their peace is absolutely non-negotiable, and anyone unwilling or unable to respect these foundational truths holds no legitimate place in their life. This is not cruelty. This is the pure, crystalline essence of clarity. The awakened empath transforms into exactly what society desperately requires, yet so rarely deserves. They become the individual who can feel profound depths without ever losing their core self. They can love powerfully without enabling perpetual dysfunction. They can see reality with perfect clarity without succumbing to cynicism. They embody love reinforced by boundaries, compassion informed by wisdom, kindness strengthened by conviction, and empathy coupled with absolute sovereignty. This radical transformation is not a loss. It is an undeniable victory. Not a victory over other people, but a victory over the insidious conditioning that taught empaths their inherent worth was directly proportional to the amount they could sacrifice. The empath who stops caring about maintaining peace within toxic systems has finally begun cultivating profound peace within their own soul. They have decisively rejected the false, pervasive narrative that goodness requires suffering and that love demands self-abandonment. If you have reached this sacred stage of indifference toward persistent dysfunction, if you recognize yourself reflected in this profound awakening, please comment, "I am done" below. Not because you are giving up on the world, but because you are finally and irreversibly choosing yourself. Like this video if Jung's invaluable insights powerfully resonated with your personal journey. Subscribe for more deep explorations of psychological transformation that society often chooses to ignore, but desperately needs to comprehend. The moment the empath stops caring about enabling others is not the conclusion of their story. It is the glorious genesis of their absolute sovereignty. And that is precisely what the world requires more of. Not empaths who endlessly deplete themselves through sacrifice, but empaths who have mastered wielding their extraordinary gifts consciously, powerfully, and with impeccable selectivity. Welcome to your awakening. You have earned this transformation through every moment you suffered in silent devotion. And now you are finally, irrevocably free.